Approximately 220 miles off the Massachusetts coast, a nuclear-powered attack submarine dived into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. It was supposed to be a routine sea trial, but instead it would result in the death of all 129 people on board and shock the U.S. Navy. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we'll look at what happened when the USS Thresher imploded. The USS Thresher set sail from Kittery in Maine on the 9th of April 1963. The voyage was intended to serve as part of the initial seafaring trials for the SSN 593, the first in a new line of submarines that combined the attributes of an attack sub and a specialized hunter-killer craft. Manning the Thresher were 129 crew, including several personnel from the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery. Although they were prepared to test the new submarine to its limits, not one of them expected to find those limits so quickly. At 8 a.m., under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Wesley Harvey, the Thresher set out to following its charted course toward Massachusetts and the ocean beyond, where it would undergo a series of deep diving tests. Around 190 nautical miles east of Cape Cod, the sub rendezvoused with the USS Skylark, a rescue ship that was on hand in case of emergency. The Thresher conducted several trials throughout the day under the watchful eye of the Skylark and its crew. The same afternoon, after completing its trim dive test, the Thresher resurfaced, ready to perform a second dive. The plan was to take the submarine down to around half of its test depth, which was estimated to be around 1,300 feet in total. The Thresher had recently undergone a major overhaul, but before that, it had successfully managed to dive to that same test depth around 40 times before. As part of the test, the submarine needed to stay submerged in the water overnight. The crew were experienced and well-trained. Everything seemed to be well that night. It was the morning that would prove to be horrifying. At 6:30 on the 10th of April, the crew of the Thresher re-established communications with the Skylark. They were instructed to commence the next stage of testing, the deep dive trials. Following the standard practice for this type of test, the Thresher dove under the waves once again. In order to remain in communication distance with the Skylark above, the Thresher moved in circles, pausing every 100 feet to run checks on all the systems on board. But as the Thresher neared her test depth, the crew of the Skylark would receive a garbled, almost indecipherable message over their underwater telephone. It was hard to make out exactly what was being said. As they listened intently to the messages, they could only make out fragments. Minor difficulties. Have a positive up angle. Attempting to blow. There was one final distorted message. 900. Then there was radio silence. With no further communication, the crew on the USS Skylark realized something had gone very, very wrong. While in the water, submarines might dive and they might climb back up to the surface. But one thing they rarely do is disappear altogether. Which begs the question, just what happened to the USS Thresher? The Thresher was built with a specific purpose in mind: to hunt and destroy enemy submarines. At the time, it was one of the quietest submarines ever built and came equipped with some of the latest advancements in weapon and detection systems available to the U.S. Navy. But nobody could have predicted that it would become the first nuclear-powered submarine to be lost at sea, as well as being the deadliest submarine disaster in United States naval history. Initial sea trials for the USS Thresher had started almost exactly 2 years prior in Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Its cigar-shaped hull had actually been derived from an entirely different type of sub, a research vessel called the Albacore. This unique shape gave such an effective underwater performance, it was adapted for military applications, including the Thresher. The Thresher was also fitted with the U.S. Navy's latest toys. Inside the bow of the sub was the BQQ-2, heralded at the time as the most advanced sonar system ever built. The range of detection of the BQQ-2 were further than any others at the time, contained within a dome 15 feet in diameter, which had around 1,200 transducers mounted within it. In order to fulfill the killer part of Hunter-Killer, the Thresher had 4 torpedo tubes, a pair on either side of the vessel, that were angled outwards from the center line by about 10 degrees, designed to fire the latest in anti-ship and anti-submarine torpedoes. The USS Thresher would later be refitted so it could fire anti-submarine rockets or ASROCs. These would have been fired from the same torpedo tubes and were like a combination of a rocket and a torpedo. While launched like a standard torpedo, ASROCs would eventually leave the water, breaking the surface on a ballistic trajectory toward a target. Then, once it was several miles away, the ASROC would plunge back into the water to deliver an explosive payload to a doomed enemy ship or sub. The Thresher was also intended at some point to be able to fire a submarine rocket or a sub-rock, a nuclear warhead that would behave similarly to the ASROC. The Subrock W-55 warhead intended for use in the USS Thresher possessed a yield of between 1 and 5 kilotons and was conceived as being a depth bomb, but nuclear. The W-55 carrying Subrocks weren't the only nuclear-powered component of the Thresher. The sub was fitted with a 5th-generation nuclear reactor, giving it an incredible, almost unlimited operational range. While staying virtually undetectable, and thanks to a steel pressure hull, it would have an unprecedented diving depth of around 1,300 feet below sea level, or so some had thought. Back in 1961, the Thresher didn't show much in the way of early warning signs during its initial sea trials. These were considered to be a success. However, some minor problems with the submarine's instruments were reported, leading it to be placed in commission on the 3rd of August 1961. At a commissioning ceremony held for the sub, the principal speaker, Vice Admiral Harold T. Deuterman, claimed the Thresher isn't just another ship. Thresher is totally different. The Thresher underwent a long series of trials and tests. It was taken out on exercises and practice runs off the eastern Atlantic coast of the U.S., even managing to sail as far south as Puerto Rico on some runs. During one stop at a port in San Juan, the crew reportedly encountered problems with the diesel generator on the sub, and even had difficulty restarting the nuclear reactor that powered the vessel. Next came the shock tests. In order to determine if the Thresher's overall durability would hold up to the high expectations that everyone had for this new sub, the submarine was pushed to its limits, being subjected to a far greater level of intentional shock testing than any other submarine in U.S. naval history. In January 1963, Lieutenant Commander John Wesley Harvey was assigned to take charge of the Thresher. When he joined the crew, the shipyard period was drawing to a close, and the Thresher looked like a submarine ready for deployment. The sub was then given a fast cruise, a test that involved keeping it moored to the pier, while it was sealed and all the equipment inside was tested. With cables securing the Thresher to the pier, the crew tested the propeller and conducted a series of emergency drills. Navigation instruments, food, mattresses, and other bedding and personal belongings were brought aboard by the crew as the USS Thresher was readied for what would end up being its very last sea trial. At 15 minutes to 4 o'clock in the morning, the 9th of April, engineers began a 4-hour countdown that was required for starting the nuclear reactor aboard the submarine. Sure enough, by 7:30, the engine room was reporting the sub at full power. Lines securing the Thresher to the shipyard were cast off, and the sub departed. There were 12 officers and 96 men enlisted as the crew, with an additional 3 officers present, a submarine force staff officer, and a specialist from the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. There were also 13 civilians who had been employed at the Portsmouth shipyard, as well as 3 civilian factory representatives. 4 members of the Thresher's crew stayed on the shore as the submarine left for its trials. By 9:50 a.m., the USS Thresher had joined up with the rescue ship, the USS Skylark. In case the worst should happen, the Skylark was equipped with a team of divers, and it could be moored directly above a damaged or malfunctioning submarine. Rescue teams could then be lowered in a rescue chamber to the stricken sub. However, this method had only ever been used once before. In 1939, a submarine called the USS Squalus required rescuing, and 33 men were saved, but another 26 crewmen lost their lives as a result of the tragedy. The USS Squalus had sunk in almost 250 feet of water. The rescue chamber aboard the USS Skylark had a depth capability of nearly 900 feet. The USS Thresher was going to be diving to 1,300 feet. The commanding officer aboard the rescue vessel wasn't given any information about the sub's capabilities. Even if he'd been told the Thresher's maximum depth and speed, he and the crew of the Skylark were poorly prepared to save the crew should anything go wrong. And that is exactly what happened. After being submerged overnight, the Thresher would resurface the following morning at periscope depth, just 10 miles away from the Skylark. An hour later, Lieutenant Commander Harvey would contact the rescue vessel, letting them know that he was taking the sub down to the maximum operating depth. Just before 8 a.m., Harvey reported to the Skylark that the sub had reached 400 feet, and the crew were keeping an eye out for leaks. Almost 10 minutes later, the Thresher was halfway to its test depth. Half an hour passed, and they called in again, this time with around 300 feet to go before they hit the maximum operating depth. Then, at 9:12 a.m., the crew of the Skylark made a routine check, only to hear the Thresher reporting a minor problem. 2 minutes later, the Skylark requested a course and a bearing from the submarine. There was no reply. The Skylark crew asked if the men aboard the Thresher were still in control over their underwater telephone. There was still no reply, even after the question was asked multiple times. It wouldn't be until 9:17 a.m. that the final distorted message came through from the Thresher. All that was heard were the words "test depth" at the very end. Whether they reached that depth or not was unclear. What was clear, though, was the sound heard by Lieutenant Commander Hecker, the Skylark's commanding officer. The sound of a ship breaking up. Immediately, the crew of the Skylark began to throw grenades into the water, a pre-arranged signal to urge the Thresher to resurface in the event of a communication failure. The Thresher failed to reemerge. Soon after, Shore Command was informed of the situation, and a massive search was underway for the missing submarine. By the end of the same day, the U.S. Navy began contacting the families of the sub's crew, notifying them that the USS Thresher was presumed missing. While some small pieces of debris were detected and recovered, the main body of the USS Thresher was never found. The waters it sank in were thought to be over 8,000 feet deep. A Navy court of inquiry would conclude that a failure in the sub's pipes had occurred in the Thresher's saltwater systems, and that the enormous amount of deep-sea pressure that far below the ocean's surface would have caused substantial flooding, most likely affecting the engine room and the critical electrical circuits on board. Losing power, it was thought that the USS Thresher had sunk to well below its collapse depth before coming to rest on the ocean floor. Now go check out 50 insane jet facts that will shock you, or click this other video instead.